We've got about 15 minutes for the discussion, so we'll collect the questions in groups of 3 or 4 or so, and then allow the panelists to respond to those questions in those groups. Thank you.
Thanks. Ursula Phillips. My question is really to Łukasz, but maybe to others as well. I find it very interesting to read those texts that you put up by Czartoryski and by Jaworski and others. And my question really is, did you come across, or have you come across cases of a possible dual or double identity? Because we tend to talk about identity in this context as though there is a solid Polish identity, or there's a solid Belarusian or Lithuanian or indeed Ukrainian identity. Have you come across any cases in the 19th century or later of a sort of double self-identification? I'm thinking particularly of that group of poets who are normally called by Polish critics the Ukrainian school. Yeah? So we have Bogdan Zaleski and others. And of course, the wider context is, some of these bigger poets like Słowacki, who drew enormous amount of inspiration from Ukrainian culture. And Mickiewicz always identified himself as a Litvin. There's a lot of Belarusian influence on his poetry. Other poets connected with him, like Czechot, saw themselves as, partially Belarusian. So I just wonder, have you come across any of these type of cases here? Thanks.
Actually, until Miłosz, Konwicki and Gombrowicz, Polish literature is there. Mickiewicz never was in Warsaw, in Kraków, in Gdańsk, he never visited, actually what is Korona, what was called Korona before. So, and the landscape of Polish literature is, of course, the landscape of what is not anymore and will not anymore be in Poland. But it doesn't damage this literature. I think it helps. Lithuanian nature is much more beautiful than Polish. But actually, I would like to ask Robert Frost. It was extremely interesting, especially not for historians like me, lecture. But I would like to understand better what you postulate, what you want us to do, or general intellectual public to do, to take this part of history as the history of creation of nation. I can understand that Ukrainians took initiative, which was forgotten in all these 3 or at least 2 unions. But I don't really see that it helped or it was work for Ukrainian nationhood. I think it prevented it rather, or worked against. So I would like to understand you better how it can be a part. Of course, these are facts, so we should learn, we should teach about facts. But facts actually comes from the Latin word fatio facere feci factum, which is construction. So how it can construct the narration that can help Ukrainian nation to live, to survive. Thank you.
So this is more of a comment, and it's on the generation of historians of Shevchenko, Prytzak, Dashkevich, Isayevich, both in the West and in Ukraine. Almost all of them were concentrated on one issue in a certain way, and that was the Wyzwolenie Zmagania and the failure of the liberation struggle. Rudnitsky is born in Vienna as a refugee from the Polish-Ukrainian War. Prytzak's father is killed in the Polish-Ukrainian War. Shevchenko winds up as a Petlura emigration in Warsaw, leaving. Isayevich's father is a member of the Centralna Rada and stays in France not to live under Poland until he finally comes back. And of course, Dashkevich's mother is the great heroine of the Siczowi Strelci. So in a certain way, when you said that they didn't work on World War II, I think they all lived under the shadow of the failed Wyzwolenie Zmagania. And all of them were obviously closely integrated with Polish culture and knew it well, and then work above that topic. But really, their whole life biographies are an outcome of, in many ways, in most cases, the Polish-Lithuanian conflict, and in one, the failed Polish-Ukrainian rapprochement.
Do we have one more question, sir? Not yet? Okay. Would you like to respond?
So thank you for this interesting question. So I would answer on the following way. The very term double identity is for me quite, I would say, unspecified, because we can actually divide this double identity into three subdivisions. So firstly, for example, it's people who were brought up and educated in one culture, and then during his lifetime they changed their national identity. And the most famous cases of such people who were called Perekinczyki very often in that time, or people who jump over to another nation, is Włodzimierz Antonowicz, Volodymyr Antonowicz, great Ukrainian historian, and also a man who strongly condemned actually Polish past and Polish cultural presence in Ukraine. But in the end of his lifetime, he started to launch attempts of dialogue with Poland, reconciliation. So he was one of the initiator of the so-called New Era in 1890. So an attempt to find a modus vivendi between Poles and Ukrainians in Galicia. Then, of course, it is already mentioned here Wieczysław Lipiński or Wacław Lipiński and Andrzej Szeptycki. But this is people who change their identity. Then we have people who have a double identity, but in the sense that one identity was regional and another was, let's say, national. No, it's Mickiewicz is like patriot of Grand Duchy of Lithuania, but also definitely a Pole by conviction. But it's in Polish, let's say, Polish-Lithuanian, Polish-Belarusian relations. In terms of Polish-Ukrainian relations, I have quoted Adam Jerzy Czartoryski, who then further in a passage I did not quote, said that he himself or actually his family came from Czartorysk, from Volhynia, and therefore he feels also this affinity to Ruthenian lands. But it's also, let's say, General Dwernicki, one of the military leaders of November uprising, 1831 in Poland, or actually it's not uprising, but a revolution or Polish-Russian war. Then different men and different representatives of Polish literature, even Juliusz Słowacki. So you quoted this Polish school in Ukrainian school in Polish poetry. And then third, we have people, but really this group is absolutely the most, the smallest one. People who tried to be both Ukrainian and Poles, but I think perhaps Platon Kostecki, this poet I quoted, might be assessed as such a person, but you know, many identity. It's not possible to have equally important, equally dominating national identity during his lifetimes. Also to separate national identity. So one identity preponderates, one dominates sooner or later, and therefore. I can't recall a person of such importance like let's say Mykola Gogol in Russian-Ukrainian relations, who said that he has two souls. One is Pan-Russian soul, one is Ukrainian, and he does not know which soul is more important. Thank you.
If I might add something to that question. it strikes me, or has always seemed to me, that one of the problems with the Polish-Lithuanian Union and that question of dual identity is that the Union never invents the concept of akin to Britishness. Those of us from north of the border here have recently had to decide what our identity is. Now, some of us, in fact quite a few of us, decided that our identity was both British, which is not English, and Scottish. The problem is that the concept of Sarmatia as a potential British idea was never incorporated officially. In Britain, James VI came south in 1603 and went to Parliament and said, we're going to form a British monarchy. To the English Parliament. The English Parliament said, no, we're English. And so James created the idea of Britishness by his royal prerogative. And then in 1707, when the parliaments united between Scotland and England, they were fused into a new concept called the British state, which sat above Scotland and England. Wales had been incorporated, so nobody bothered about Wales, into England. That meant that, as in all unions, as in the British Union, where English became the language of the ruling elite, as it is becoming the language of the ruling elite in the European Union, which is why we can have a conference here, all of us speaking English, which we couldn't have had 20 years ago, because the previous generation of Polish and Ukrainian historians wouldn't have known English well enough to speak here. In Poland, Polish became the language. I speak English. That does not make me an Englishman. Speaking Polish does not make you a Pole. Now, the difference culturally between the Polish-Lithuanian and the British Union is that the cultural dominance actually did not lie with, in many ways, what is the dominant political partner, the Kingdom of Poland. Scotland in 1603 and 1707 was bloody poor. Hordes of very poor noblemen came south. One of the great problems with the Union of Lublin is that the execution of the law with regard to royal estates was not extended to Lithuania or to the Ukrainian lands that were incorporated into Crown Poland. That meant a great deal. It made defense of the realm very difficult because the monies went to the wealthy nobility, the great magnates, who formed and had great cultural patronage power, the Radziwiłł, the Sapieha, the Wiśniewiecki, the Ostrowski, and that was a system they liked. And this is tied up with what were one of the problems with the development of Cossackdom is something that Frank showed years ago, that in the Ukrainian Palatinates, the difference between the nobility and the rest, the nobility in the Kiev Palatinate was much smaller than it was in the rest of Poland. 1% of the population compared with 6, 8, 25% in Mazovia, where everybody was a noble and everybody was poor, which meant that those excluded from this great new citizenship, their status was uncertain. And actually what goes on after 1569 in Ukraine, in what is now Ukraine, is as much a struggle between the great lords. Now you can call them Poles, they weren't Poles. Or some of them were, because they could get land in these territories after the Union. A lot of them were native Ruthenians, who either did become Catholics or didn't become Catholics. Now that's one of the power of the identity. You can't say, you know, yes, you can have Natione Polonus gens Rutenus or Roxolanus or whatever you want to say, and that really did operate with people like Czartoryski. But it's not the same as saying, I'm British or Sarmatian. Sarmatian was just an origin myth. Sorry, that's rather long, but to get to your question, I have no idea how this can help modern Ukrainian nationhood. That's not my purpose. My purpose is to say you can't explain what goes on here in terms of assuming certain assumptions about a Ukrainian nation that existed then. The Ukrainian nation emerged as the result of a process. We historians are very good now about talking about the process of nation formation and building, yet frequently when it comes to politics we go back and assume there was the same Ukrainian nation in 1569 as there is today or there was then. Part of my appeal to Ukrainian historians is to go back and write about Rus as a totality and not just say, well, that lot are Belarusian up there, we're not going to write about them. Because Ruthenians at the time taking part in the politics of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, of Litva, they believed in Rus, and they didn't think it ended where the Union of Lublin drove the border accidentally. Mozir becomes part of the Grand, or remains part of the Grand Duchy because Radziwiłł Rudi happens to be its starosta, and Sigismund August doesn't want to cause him any more trouble than he's having anyway. The nation emerges out of this, but the national divides clearly are determined in very large part by the border put within Rus by Lublin. But that's not the border they're concerned with. They actually want more. They want Brest and further north in some of the Ruthenian proposals in 1569. They want to extend Rus that joins the crown, but they don't get away with that. That doesn't happen. But they are thinking in terms of Rus. By the time that Frank was talking about in the 18th century, yes, Ukraine has now become a concept. And as he showed this morning, it's on the left bank. It's on the part that's no longer in the Commonwealth. But as regards this, I'm rather with the Polish critics of volumes 3 to 6 of the Great History, who say, you can talk about Ukraine in the 15th century, but we're not going to because it's Rus, and we don't think this term is valid. Very long. But we did start late.
Okay, Frank, thanks for this comment. It is very interesting in a sense that it's how we construct our lives and our experiences and what is most important for them. Of course, Shevchenko and Hrytsak were refugees, World War II refugees, but again, judging by what you're saying, conceptualized their lives in a wake of a different type of a major event and catastrophe. What I was thinking also about lumping together Dashkevich, Isayevich on the one hand, and Shevchenko and Prytsak and maybe some others on the other, is that both Dashkevich and Isayevich at the end of their lives certainly deal very much with World War II and with World War II memories, either in their writings or in the position of the directors of the two institutions, when this doesn't happen in North America. And I wonder, again, whether this is true or not, but the question of the fact that intellectuals are outside of their societies, whether that makes it easier to build bridges and talk about that, or being part of the society and the discourse and the loyalties that are there really make this more difficult. Because I don't think that once, especially Isayevich, when he moves into World War II issues, there are many more bridges built with his Polish counterparts than were before. My impression is that it's less. So, but again, it's a broader question of being part of the society or being outside of the society. What makes you freer and better positioned to engage in dialogue and continue the dialogue?
Just a little bit. Double identity, I think that it is possible, even in 19th century. I couldn't agree with you. And I think that there is a difference between what you are thinking about yourself, and how people perceived your position. So thinking about Szeptycki is different when the Poles are talking about him, and especially in the interwar period, accusing him, or, for example, his mother is also a good example how she perceived his attitude as a traitor, yes? And I think that it is a principle of exclusion, yes? But I have no problem with identity. For example, I could be also Ukraine as well, Ukrainian as Paul, and it is no problem for me.
Excellent. On that note, I think we might have to end the discussion. But do remember the discussion will continue in 20 minutes' time when we have a roundtable session. But please join me in thanking our excellent panel.